Thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be here and to be able to talk with you. Everything that I'm going to say now is just the white noise portion. Steve went over the highlights, which, we all know we are not to forsake the meeting of getting together. And I think what the last year has shown us is that we are willing to forsake meeting. A lot of churches are willing to forsake meeting. A lot of people are willing to forsake meeting. And in that, as Steve said, what are we afraid of? Really, the worst the government in Washington was threatening to do was monetary fines. We should fear God much more than we fear man. And so I hope, I do not believe that this is the end of it. Once Satan finds a way or a chink in the armor, then he keeps chipping away at it. And so I think that we've seen round one. And so now is the time to prepare for round two. It may get more intense, and you need to have a plan together for your particular church when round two does come. But knowing that you've seen the last year and how you responded within your churches and within your ministries, and how you can perhaps respond going forward if this or when this happens again. I wanted to go over today some basics, so this might be a real yawn session for some of you, but just the basic functionality of the government and the branches of government. So we have the judicial, the legislative, and then the executive branches of government. And if you think about it, history always repeats itself. And so what you have within that context, you had the time of judges in the Bible, you had the time of kings, and then you had the time within the context of the Jewish rulers. They had their blanking on the name now, but like the Sanhedrin, and the sort of different legislative bodies that legislated for them. And what we have shown repeatedly over time with every civilization is that there is no amount of legislating that you can do to put morality in the heart of man. That is a Jesus thing that happens through the Spirit, and we just continue to legislate more and more laws. And what you have is this attenuation between freedom and liberty. The more someone gets freedom or exercises their freedom, the less liberty someone else has. And it kind of moves between these two continuums. And what we are seeing right now is an unprecedented move away from freedom and towards liberties for non-Christians, and then vice versa. We are having our liberties and rights taken away, and we need to stand up and push back against that. Within the context of the separation of powers, you've got the judiciary, which is where all of the courts of law, that's where your cases are heard. And there's the state courts, and then there are the federal courts. Federal courts, as the name would imply, hear federal matters. State courts hear state law matters. And so within that context, Pacific Justice Institute has taken some cases, or a singular case, to the the federal Supreme Court, where we were actually able to lift a ban in Santa Clara County that banned worship services in that county. It was the most restrictive county. That's right down in the Silicon area, and that was a big win. What we have found recently is that now Gavin Newsom is in threat of being recalled, and so he's backing up quickly off of all of his orders, and people are allowed to meet again, and those are slowly being repealed. But again, we've seen what can be done and how quickly rights can be taken away. Excuse me. I want to say that the Constitution does rule supreme, but if it does, then why did we have our rights taken away? Why are we being slowly edited and having these freedoms taken from us? And that is because the courts will view different cases with different levels of scrutiny. There is strict scrutiny, there is intermediate scrutiny, and there is rational scrutiny. And strict scrutiny is usually there has to be a religious nexus in order for the government to use strict scrutiny or freedom of speech or a constitutional right. And what they will then do is look and say, is there a compelling interest, and has the government narrowly tailored whatever the law is that they are trying to enforce? What you had in New York with Archdiocese case was that Governor Cuomo was enforcing a no more than 10 people could be in a church at a time, if at all, in the red zones, but you had Target open, and Target, the super Targets, could hold up to hundreds and hundreds of people, even at 50% capacity. So that was struck down as being unconstitutional. So they look at it in a framework of, are we treating churches in a way that discriminates against them more heavily and burdensome than it does against every other type of like situated service or or goods or retail. What we found out quickly what our government thinks essential and non-essential are, and it just shows us where our society is at. When you have, drugstores and alcohol and things like that can remain open, but churches can't meet, you can tell where the moral disrepair is sneaking into our society. Within that context, some of you may or may not have had complaints filed against you, and what you probably heard from is your Department of Health, perhaps Labor and Industry, or some other government agency. And government agency is it's a real encroachment onto our constitutional rights, and it functions outside of the normal bounds of the three branches of government, and it's its own quasi-judicial, quasi-legislative, quasi-executive branch, and each agency has their own powers. What will often happen is that the legislature will enact a law, and then they leave a lot of the policy and the specifics up to the particular agency who is going to be enforcing that law. And so over time, what will happen is that these loosely based policies and procedures that you're not even sure who wrote them or how they got into place, but those are what become law. That's the functionality at the agency level. And so for our state in Washington, if someone complained about your church not following the ordinances or the executive orders, what would happen is they would call the Department of Health, lodge a complaint anonymously, and this is another way that Satan works, is that he turns people against people. And when you can complain anonymously, you're a lot more bold with what you will do than if you had to go up and do it, in a public space and, say stone someone or something like that. So it makes you not necessarily a good witness because you can do so anonymously when you complain. There is this concept of jurisdiction. How does an agency get jurisdiction over you? They can get it over you by licensing you. So if you are a doctor or like a lawyer, there's different agencies that govern what you do. With churches, the Department of Health was the governing body that was reaching out most often. They have jurisdiction just by nature of the fact that they're trying to enforce these mandates against individuals and then put churches in a responsibility position of enforcing these things. And you can see the trickle-down effect. The governor really has no authority to enforce any of these orders. What he's done is give them and then relies on the agencies to compel people to abide by them. And then, so on and so forth from there. With restaurants, what you had was the Liquor Control Board was enforcing their liquor licenses, and that's where their bread and butter is, so they were going to do whatever the government told them to do. For churches, a lot of times it would be L&I with your employee relations, and they would contact L&I in order to see what was going on there. We're very fortunate insofar as being and meeting on Sundays. The Department of Health, they don't work on Sundays, and most people are not going to be in church on a Sunday if they are not a believer. What we've had more complaints as we reopen and move towards that is from weddings and funerals. I would caution you, if you're a church and you're going to do a wedding or a funeral and it's not for a member of your congregation, you put yourself at risk there because you're going to have outside people coming in, and there's been a lot of complaints stemming from that. So be careful with what you do and who you let close to your flock. What do we do next time? That's something that I wanted to touch on because, as I said in the beginning, I think this is round one. I think that this will happen again, and I think it will continue to gain more speed behind it. And so what I would advise, and again, I'm not in a position to tell you what to do. All I can do is advise you based on what we've seen and what we've experienced with PJI. You want to make sure that within your church body you have different individuals, whether they're elders or however your church functions, that can meet with different families if you have to break up into smaller pods. What I am guessing will happen next time is there's going to be more enforcement on site at churches trying to sort of lock them down. We don't know that for sure, but again, what Satan does is he'll ramp up his efforts over time. So being prepared in the future to go forward, the church had to meet in people's homes, as Steve was talking about earlier, and so be prepared for that if necessary. COVID-19 presented an opportunity for all churches to grow, And if your church is growing, how do you tend to your flock? What do you do for the next go around? If your church has shrunk, then you need to kind of take a step back and say, what can, assess what is going on, and if there are outreach programs that you can have, or ways in which you can help people to strengthen their faith rather than shying away from it. I wanted to also touch on some issues that are germane to Washington State. I don't know where everyone is from, but there are, as Steve mentioned, there's a lot of what we're calling SOGI laws, or SOGI. It's sexual orientation and gender identity laws. The church right now is really insulated because you've got the ministerial exception. Most everyone who is hired within a church knows that they're going to be ministering on some level, and so there isn't great issue being taken there. And also, people who have these type of issues, they're mental health issues, and the demons that sort of possess them aren't going to want to come into a church setting because it irritates the demon, and they're likely to have to flee at the name of Jesus. So you're unlikely to see people applying for jobs within the church with sexual identity or orientation issues, but what you may have at your church are sort of what I would call fingerling activities or associations. If you've got a school that's under a separate entity, if you've got outreach programs within your communities that are under separate entities, or the like, you want to make sure that there is a ministerial function where they are teaching the Bible, where they've got different outreach programs within that job title from the get-go, written into the job description. What we have found, there's a case that just came down from the Supreme Court of Washington that was with Union Gospel Mission, which we have locally and then within the state, and they were going to hire an attorney, and I believe he may have even worked there part-time or something, but he identified as bisexual, and as time came out, he came out as a gay male. And they would not hire him because of his gender identity or sexual identity. And he sued Union Gospel Mission. It was dismissed at the lower court level, but he appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court. Prior to this case, the Supreme Court had held that these types, Union Gospel Mission, who are Christian-based nonprofits, could exclude certain people from their ministry. But the Supreme Court this last go-around held that a lawyer's position is not per se ministerial, and there are issues of law that need to be decided. So it sent it back down for a ruling in keeping with that. So that's very, concerning on a lot of levels. And also what you will find within your, church body is a lot of business owners who are concerned. A lot of states inward, which are red, have the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that was enacted in 1993, and that sort of protects Christian-based businesses from what I would call persecution from the sexual orientation and gender identity laws. There was the Hobby Lobby case, which many of you may be familiar with, and that was sort of a seminal case that came out of that protection. Washington State doesn't have that law. So there is no protection. I have a business right now who is in the middle of a Human Rights Commission issue because they won't, sort of play in that arena. And they really don't have a lot of protection. And so then we come to the question of what do you do as a business owner? How do you protect yourself? And at this point, I think there is a need for Christians to get involved in governmental affairs in some way, shape, or form. I think we've all shied away from that for a long time, but what we have now is the opportunity. If you are a mom and your children are in school, get on that school board. If you are in any way, shape, or form able to get somehow involved into politics or do some lobbying. Lobbying is something that I eschewed for a very long time, but I have seen how effective it can be. It takes a lot of money, and I think it's sort of, those pools are deep over in Olympia for our area. But if you can get involved in getting some bills to the floor by lobbying with your local representatives or even with some lobbying agencies, it really, it works. Of course, prayer is the key to any and all of this, and protecting what we're doing and how we're doing it. We have been put in a position now where, the churches are, I don't want to go too far, but I think there's a certain amount of judgment that comes, from the Lord when we have challenges. And if you have in any way backed off of your ministry, it's time to full throttle and speed ahead. Again, our governor just shifted from mandates to recommendations. The recommendations now for Washington are, I think, 50% capacity, unlimited number of singers, and a few other things that I can go over in the Q&A session. But there's no reason not to be growing and gaining in your ministries. And Pacific Justice Institute comes alongside you as, in a fashion like Deborah. Barak needed Deborah in a time when he was scared in the Bible. And Deborah came alongside and said, go forward, God will be with you. And Pacific Justice Institute is here to back you up in whatever way, shape, or form that takes. You have to do your job and what God has called you to do. And in step with that, Pacific Justice Institute wants to come alongside anywhere that you need help. And we are in Washington, we are in California, in various other states on the East Coast and sort of southern border. But what we have the opportunity to do in a lot of these federal claims is the Ninth Circuit is our circuit, and there's a lot of states contained within that we can help co-represent or find counsel in your state to help out in a case if you find yourself in the middle of something. What your particular legal issues will probably look like over the coming year are going to be agency. My advice to you is do not talk to agencies. Agencies, again, are quasi-judicial, quasi-legislative, and quasi-executive. They can take anything that you say and use it against you. You have constitutional protections, but because it's not a criminal, granted, the laws are written in such a way that there's civil fines and then they can be prosecuted if they're passed off to your prosecutor. That rarely ever happens, although it could. But everything that you say in there, they take down in that file, and then they just build that case against you. No matter what kind of evidence you're trying to put forward to say, we're doing all of these things, it's almost never enough. I've never seen it go well. We're lucky in Washington that our Department of Health has not been really hyper aggressive, and neither have our police force in enforcing these things. California, whole other story. They have been threat of arrest, the police will come down and break up services. I mean, they've just been really aggressive. And what you find in places like California and New York in particular is there's very little care for the kind of rights that they take away from the faith-based individuals. They will give all the rights in the world to anyone who is of the world. If you look at the kind of disastrous activities that the world condones in terms of sexual immorality, drugs, drinking, those are very dangerous things. And yet, when we're in the middle of a pandemic, the world wants to say, don't meet, don't get together, keep a mask on. That's really dangerous, activity to go outside and do any of these things. But these are the same people saying that, whatever kinds of drugs you want to do, sex you want to have, etc., that's just fine. It's your body, it's your choice. And so you can see the flipping of the narrative depend on the premise of the morality, and that's where you can get into trouble quick. We do need to obey our leaders, but Jesus is our leader. And whatever gets said comes through him first, and that is vetted at a lower level. Our forefathers would they would be horrified if they could see what this has been twisted into. And agency law, again, that's where you guys are going to find yourselves in the middle of. It's very well written. Satan knows what he's doing, and he's come right outside of the three branches of government and placed these sort of civil fines and a way to get at people with money, predominantly, with your businesses, with your children, with your coffers. That's where agency can touch into. And I won't get too much into parents' rights. We had to talk about that the other week. But Pacific Justice Institute handles parent rights. And the thing that I see that are the three major threats to the Christian-based life are being able to go to church and exercise our religion, parental rights being interfered with by agencies, and then these sexual orientation and gender identity issues that are going to be coming at your kids. The government feels that it is a better parent than you are. There's a concept called Loco Parentis, and that's where the government comes in and says, we feel that we can do a better job parenting your children than you can in any given situation if the need arises. And they will take that opportunity quick to take away your parental rights. So you need to be watching your flock in terms of letting, having an outlet or a space for parents who need help if they are struggling, single moms, things like that. This is where the church should be helping out because it keeps those agencies at bay. And now the government has taken over more of the adoption type activities where that used to be church-based. I don't know how that transpired or where it's at, but that's where we find ourselves today, in the midst of agency proceedings and what is facing your church. If you have specific issues, I can answer those questions in the Q&A breakouts. But as far as your state and your particular flock goes, I would say it would be wise to outline or ask your church, your flock. I keep saying flock, sounds like a funny word. Your sheep, what needs they feel are not being met. Where you can help, and then PJI can step in and I can give talks that are specific to your people and what your needs are and what you're facing. It's going to be different in a red state than a blue state. It's going to be different in a blue county than a red county. We can tailor talks, we can tailor obviously cases to help you. And Pacific Justice Institute, it's an honor for me to be able to work with them. It's not exactly where I thought I would find myself, but we actually had, Steve gave a talk, or was speaking on a Sunday about a case that they were going to institute against the governor, and I reached out to PJI saying that I was an attorney locally and that I could help out, and that's how I came into this job. And so it's been a huge blessing for me to be able to help others. And the law is, it's very complicated and very complex. And so if you are having any particular type of issues, especially with agency, don't involve yourself with them. Reach out to PJI or someone else who can help you articulate what it is that you're doing and what needs to be done before you speak with them openly. Okay? And that's the end of my talk. Thank you all.